St. Mary Magdalene was given this special and unique privilege. In the Gospel, she's the first one to see the risen Lord, and she would be the first one to go and announce his resurrection. As she would go back to the apostles, I have seen the risen Lord. I've seen him. He's called my name. He's alive. He's not dead. He's risen, truly. And for Mary Magdalene, what a great gift and grace and privilege that was. But remember, right? Just like with Christ, there is resurrection. There's the joy, there's the excitement, enthusiasm, there's hope, and it's real and it's true. But there was also the cross, right? And for Mary Magdalene, she experienced the cross. I mean, she was there at the cross of Christ, and she wept bitterly, like a lot. Even Catherine Emmerich, she recounts that Mary Magdalene in particular was almost like weeping uncontrollably. But even before that, she had her own conversion, right, from leading a sinful life. She had her own conversion where she met Christ, and she decided from now on, with God's help, I'm going to be different. With the help of Jesus, my life will not be the same. And it's true, and it wasn't. She was forever changed. And because of that, the cross and the resurrection, because of the suffering that she had, but also the grace of God, she was able then to have this great moment of seeing the resurrection. In a similar way, like with St.Ann and St. Joachim, we recalled yesterday how in their marriage, in the early years, they had so much going for them. There was a lot of great things happening. They had a great start to their marriage. God bless them, good for them. But we also know that for all of us, right? For all of us, that we will have the cross, it'll come at some point. It'll come back if it's left us at some point. For all of us to be faithful followers of Christ, we know there's a cross. We know that our cross is a sharing in Jesus' cross. And today, what I want to share with you is just a little bit of a serious cross for St. Anne and St. Joachim that they were asked to carry, that was theirs, and it was there to help, I believe, to help to purify them. So let's continue on with our life of St. Anne through the visions of Catherine Emmerich. We ended off yesterday with the early years of their marriage. Everything's going great. And this is yesterday's homily. You don't want to hear that one again, do you? Okay, this is the one I'm looking for. So then today, as we continue on, we hear a story now where St. Anne is a lot harsh on one of her servants. And something terrible results, something that she regrets, probably for the rest of her life. Catherine Emmerich, she says this, that St. Anne's, she says, maidservant, like her servant, had been led astray by a relation of Joachim. Somehow she'd been taken away from them, or something had happened that was bad. And Anne, in great distress of this infringement, reproached her somewhat severely for her fault. And the maidservant took her misfortune to heart, so much so that she delivered prematurely a stillborn child. And so St. Anne, this servant, had done something really bad, and St. Anne disciplined her, but her servant took it so much to heart. She was pregnant at that time that it actually caused this servant to have a stillborn child, right? To give birth way too early, and the child couldn't live. After this, Anne was inconsolable over this, fearing that it was all her fault. How would you feel after that, right? For St. Anne, she felt guilty, she felt ashamed, she felt responsible for what had happened in this stillbirth, this stillborn child. And so as all of this happened, St. Anne herself too was pregnant. She was pregnant with her first child. And due to the guilt and grief now that she felt as well for having done this, she gave birth quite prematurely as well. But lucky for her, her child lived. And they would name this first child Maria. However, they knew that she was not the child of the promise, because, remember the M, right? She didn't have the marks of the promise. The predictions, the prophecies, the signs, they did not accompany her birth. And St. Anne felt horrible because she felt like, again, it was her fault, that this child wasn't the child of the promise because of what she had done to her servant, and that in some way this was God's punishment for what she had done. That's how St. Anne interpreted it at that time. Now, as we continue on, they have their first child, and they, after this, couldn't have any more children. They didn't have another child. They didn't know, but we know now looking back, that they didn't have another child for 19 years. Think of that. If you were like maybe 20, 21, 22, maybe 19 when she had her first child, and then not for 20 years, that's almost all of her time of fertility, right? That's almost all of her possible motherhood. She couldn't have any more children. And for her and Saint Joachim, these barren years were a great suffering. It was really, really hard on them. Yet they would continue in their practices to persevere in prayer, in offering sacrifices, in giving to the poor. We mentioned their law of charity. And in the midst of their great distress and not being able to have children, this is what she writes. She says, "For 19 years after the birth of their first child, they lived thus devoutly before God, in constant yearning for the gift of fruitfulness, and with an increasing distress." As the years went by, it became more and more of a burden, not being able to bear fruit. She then goes on to speak of how other people treated them, both St. Anne and Joachim. And this is what Catherine Emmerich writes. She says, "I saw ill-disposed neighbors coming to them and speaking ill of them, saying that they must be bad people, since no children were born to them." Right? That they must have done something wrong. God must be punishing them. Why don't you have any children? And it was so bad that not only were they like picking apart St. Anne and Joachim, remember what I said yesterday, right? That if for the saints, like people either love them or hate them. You either want to admire them or you want to tear them apart, right? There's not a lot of wiggle room or middle ground for how we look at the saints, because they're like a mirror that we're almost staring back at ourselves. And what do we do with that? And so for a number of people, she says, that they mocked them, made fun of them, that they enjoyed their hardship. And it was so bad that even they would make fun of Maria, of their only daughter. And they would say, I imagine even in front of her, "You must be adopted, because your parents are barren. That's not your family. You must have come from somewhere else." What a terrible thing, right? What a terrible thing for this little girl to grow up hearing that from other people and hearing what they say to her parents. Yet, in the midst of this, St. Anne and Joachim had a kind of certainty. This is what St. Anne says, Catherine Emmerich says. Anne's steadfast faith was supported by an inmost certainty that the coming of the Messiah was near, and that she herself was among his human relations. Remember what her mom told her about the M. She had a certainty in her own heart as well, that the Messiah was coming through her line somehow, in some way. God was going to make this possible, even though it seemed impossible at that time. She prayed for the fulfillment of the promise with loud supplications, and both she and Joachim were always striving after more perfect purity of life. It then goes on to describe how at this point in particular, many times, but at this point, they decided to offer special prayers and to offer a special sacrifice in the temple so that God would grant them a child. And so this is another kind of disturbing story. Joachim and Anne themselves prepared for this by penitential devotions. Catherine Emmerich says that I saw them lying on the hard earth in prayer during the night. They would stay up throughout the night praying, and girt, like wearing their penitential garments. They put on the special penitential clothes, like we might think in the Old Testament of sackcloth and ashes and these kinds of things. There was something that they wore that was a sign of penance. And then after they had prepared everything, they had done their penance, kind of preparing their own souls, then they went to the temple. And the offerings were presented, and Joachim went in to witness the offerings being sacrificed. And when he went, it was terrible what had happened. Listen. It was here at the temple that Joachim had to bear his hardest trial. I saw that one of the priests, Reuben by name, disdained his offerings and did not put them with the others on the right hand of the hall, but thrust them on one side. So we can imagine Joachim coming forward with his offerings and this priest, Reuben, just kind of pushing them to the side, having none of it. She goes on to say, he, the priest, reproached the unfortunate Joachim loudly and before the others for his unfruitfulness and refused to admit him. The priest would not accept his sacrifices. He would not accept his offerings. He too mocked him publicly before others. Joachim, she says, went away greatly distressed, and he didn't go back to St.Ann initially, but rather went away and hid. He went to be on his own and to pray and to try to figure out, what to do next. He was so ashamed and so grieved by how he had been treated in the temple. He was humiliated. During this time, Anne too experienced her own suffering around the same time as Joachim. First, she heard the story, not from Joachim himself, but from other people who had witnessed what had happened to him at the temple. And she was greatly saddened by the humiliations that he suffered. But then also she had another experience with one of her servants. This servant increased in her rudeness, and so St.Ann reproached her strongly. And then Catherine Emmerich goes on to say how this servant later on then asked if she could go away for the Feast of Tabernacles, if she could go and join in this feast. And Anne, remembering what had happened and also remembering what had happened with her other servant, she refused her permission to go. And when she did this servant attacked her, Catherine Emmerich says, so violently, declaring her barrenness and Joachim's desertion of a punishment from God for her severity. And so at the same time, we have St. Joachim and St. Anne suffering a lot, humiliation, shame, grief at their barrenness, what they had struggled with for now 19 years. She goes on to say how Anne went away sadly to her room to pray. And then in the evening, she went outside by a specific tree. And I don't know if she knew this, but Catherine Emmerich describes that the tree that she went beside was a tree that very much resembled one of the first trees, the trees in the book of Genesis, the tree that bore the forbidden fruit. And Anne went and sat under that tree and prayed probably the whole night. That tree was symbolic, very symbolic. I was thinking about, why does she mention this about the tree? She doesn't come right out and say it. But I think the reason was because Anne is preparing, even though she doesn't know it, God is preparing her by putting her under that tree for the coming of the new Eve. As Eve reached up and ate the apple, Anne's offspring, Our Lady, would not eat the apple, but she would remain faithful to God. Nevertheless, at this time we see Joachim and Anne both suffering humiliation, both really struggling at this time, but praying through it, praying their way through it. She says, Anne remained under the tree for a long time, crying to God and begging that even though he made her barren, yet he might not keep her pious companion Joachim far from her. She'd almost given up, right? Even if I have to be barren, at least don't keep, she says, like my husband from me. And we can imagine, although we don't know what happened with Joachim exactly, him praying too, right? And just asking God maybe for the barrenness to be lifted, or at least for help to be able to bear this great cross, this great burden. And so we see in Joachim and Anne that they suffered, right? There were big challenges in their life. You might look on the outside and say everything looks great, but they had internally these challenges that would even manifest in the criticism, the mockery of other people. What would happen next? What happens next? You have to come back tomorrow. What happens next? God would intervene, of course, right? God intervenes. God sees their suffering. God sees this great challenge, and he steps in as in the midst of their prayer. And so then tomorrow we'll continue on in this story, now looking at the birth of Anne's second child, who you may remember is the one who carries the M. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.